The cemetery groundskeeper had seen many things in his 30 years tending Willow Creek Memorial Park, but never this. A German shepherd sat motionless beside the freshly turned earth of grave 247, rain soaking through his brown and black coat until it hung heavy against his ribs. 3 days had passed since Robert Chen's burial. 3 days since anyone had seen the dog move more than to shift his weight from one paw to another. The animal's eyes, amber and unblinking, stayed fixed on the mound of dirt covered in wilting roses and handwritten notes that the wind had already begun to scatter across the wet grass. Tom Morrison had tried everything. He'd brought raw chicken from his own refrigerator, warmed it in the cemetery office microwave, and placed it within inches of the dog's nose. Captain, that's what the funeral attendees had called him, hadn't even acknowledged the offering. Tom had called animal control twice. Both times, the officers had taken one look at the size of the German shepherd, at the way his muscles tensed when anyone approached too close, and suggested giving him more time. "He's grieving," one officer had said, as if that explained why a dog would choose to die in a cemetery rather than seek shelter from the November storms. The rain had started the morning of the burial and hadn't stopped since. It came in sheets across the rolling hills of the memorial park, turning the paths between graves into rivers of mud and fallen leaves. Tom had watched from the maintenance shed as mourners hurried through the service, their umbrellas useless against the sideways assault of wind and water. He'd noticed the dog then, standing apart from the small gathering, his head lowered, but his gaze locked on the casket as they lowered it into the ground. When the last car had pulled away, when the gravediggers had finished their work and packed their equipment, Captain had walked to the grave and sat down. He hadn't moved since. Emma Chen wiped the condensation from her car window and stared at the shape she'd been watching from the parking lot for the past hour. Her father's dog, the animal he'd rescued from a highway median 7 years ago, the one he'd named Captain for reasons he never fully explained. The funeral director had mentioned the dog 3 times during the service, each time asking if someone would take responsibility for removing him from the property. Emma had nodded absently, her mind too fogged with grief to process the request. Now, watching the rain hammer against Captain's unmoving form, she felt something twist in her chest that wasn't quite guilt, but sat close to it. She'd driven to the cemetery every day since the burial. Each morning she'd told herself she would coax the dog into her car, take him to her father's house, figure out what to do with an animal she'd never particularly liked. Each morning she'd sat in this same parking spot, engine running, heat blasting against the November cold, and watched Captain maintain his vigil. The dog's presence accused her of something she couldn't quite name. Neglect, maybe. Or the particular betrayal of a daughter who'd let geography and career ambitions create a distance that time and tragedy couldn't bridge. She stepped out into the downpour, her black dress shoes sinking into the muddy path between the graves. Captain's ears swiveled toward the sound of her approach, but his head didn't turn. Up close, she could see the tremor running through his shoulders, whether from cold or exhaustion she couldn't tell. His paws had dug shallow trenches in the soft earth around the grave, like he'd been trying to reach something buried beneath. The smell of wet soil and decaying flowers hung thick in the air. Beneath that, something else, the distinct odor of an animal burning through its reserves, metabolizing muscle and fat in a desperate attempt to survive. "Captain," she said softly, crouching beside him, "you need to come home." The dog's only response was a low whine that seemed to originate from somewhere deep in his chest. His gaze remained locked on the grave. Emma reached out to touch his neck, feeling the rapid pulse beneath the sodden fur, the heat of a body burning through its reserves. She'd brought water and food that morning, left them just outside the cemetery fence where Tom had told her to place them. Both bowls remained untouched, the kibble turning to mush in the rain, the water diluted and overflowing. Before we continue with what happens next, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Emma had never been close to Captain. Her father had adopted the dog 2 years after her mother's death, during a period when Emma had moved across the country for work, visiting only on holidays and occasional long weekends. The dog had always seemed like a replacement, something her father poured his attention into, instead of answering her calls or accepting her invitations to visit Boston for Thanksgiving or Christmas. She'd resented the animal without quite admitting it to herself. When she'd come home for those rare visits, Captain had watched her with those amber eyes, head tilted slightly, as if measuring the distance she'd put between herself and her father, and finding her wanting. Now, staring at this creature who wouldn't abandon her father even in death, she felt the full weight of her absence settle across her shoulders. Her father had died alone. The neighbor who'd found him said he'd been dead for at least 6 hours before anyone noticed. Heart attack, sudden and massive, while taking out the trash on a Tuesday morning. Captain had been in the backyard, the neighbor reported. When the ambulance arrived, the dog had tried to climb inside with her father's body. They'd had to physically restrain him, and even then he'd tracked the ambulance to the hospital, running behind it for 3 miles before exhaustion forced him to stop. "The cemetery closes in an hour," a voice said behind her. Emma turned to find Tom Morrison standing with his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. He was older than she'd initially thought, maybe 65, with silver stubble covering his jaw and eyes that held the particular weariness of someone who'd spent too many years around death. "We can't let him stay another night. It's not healthy, for him or for the other families who come to visit their loved ones. Some people are starting to complain. They think it's disrespectful." "I know," Emma said, though she made no move to stand. "I just don't know how to get him to leave." Tom studied the dog for a long moment, rain dripping from the brim of his cap. "Your father used to come here, you know, before he died." Emma's head snapped up, water streaming down her face. "What?" "Every week for the past 3 years. Maybe longer. I only started noticing about 3 years ago. Always brought Captain. They'd sit at grave 189. That's your mother's plot, I assume." He gestured toward a grave 30 feet away, where a simple granite headstone bore her mother's name, Sarah Chen, beloved wife and mother, 1952-2018. They'd stay for about an hour, sometimes more. Your father would talk to her. I'd see his lips moving. Captain would just sit there beside him, quiet and patient, like clockwork, every Saturday morning at 9. Emma felt something cold that had nothing to do with the rain slide down her spine. She'd known her father visited her mother's grave. She'd even joined him once, during a Christmas visit 2 years ago. But weekly, for 3 years. She'd had no idea his grief still ran that deep, that he'd structured his life around a ritual she'd never witnessed. "Last time I saw them was about 2 weeks before his heart attack," Tom continued. "Captain seemed agitated that day, kept pulling toward this section of the cemetery, even though your mom's buried over there. Your father finally let him lead, and they ended up right here, where we're standing now, grave 247. He paused, watching Emma's face. "Your father stood here for maybe 10 minutes, just staring at the headstone. Then he knelt down, put his hand on the ground, and I swear I saw him crying. Only time I ever saw that man cry in all the years he came here." Emma turned to look at the grave Captain was guarding. The headstone was simple, weathered granite that had clearly stood for years. The inscription was brief: Marcus Reed, 1960-2009, at peace. No epitaph, no beloved anything, just a name and dates. Flowers had been placed here recently, before the rain started, based on their condition. Someone had been tending this grave. "Who was he?" Emma asked. "Marcus Reed?" Tom pulled out his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be a cemetery database. His thick fingers moved slowly across the screen, squinting against the rain. Not much in the system. Marcus Reed died 15 years ago. No family listed, no regular visitors according to our records. Purchased the plot himself in advance. Paid in full 3 years before his death. There's a note here. He paused, reading. Says the plot maintenance is paid through a trust fund. Flowers delivered every month, first week. Standing order with Willow Creek florist. He looked up, meeting Emma's eyes. Mean anything to you? The name triggered nothing in Emma's memory. She'd gone through her father's address book after his death, calling everyone listed to inform them of the funeral. There had been no Marcus Reed. She'd sorted through old photographs, trying to assemble material for the memorial service slideshow. No one named Marcus appeared in any caption. But the way Captain sat, rigid, protective like he was standing guard, suggested this wasn't a random grave. Dogs didn't maintain vigils over strangers. She thought about her father's weekly visits to the cemetery, about the routes he must have walked with Captain through these rows of the dead, about secrets that might have died with him, about a life her father had lived before she was born, before he became the quiet, withdrawn man she'd known, the man who'd seemed to retreat further into himself with each passing year. I need to look through my father's things, Emma said, standing abruptly. Can you... She stopped, looking down at Captain. Can you stay with him, just for a few hours? Make sure he's... I'll watch him, Tom said quietly. Got a tarp in the shed. I can at least keep some of the rain off him, and I'll call Dr. Martinez. She's a vet, volunteers at the shelter. Maybe she can at least examine him, see how bad it is. Emma nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. She reached out once more to touch Captain's head, feeling the cold dampness of his fur. The dog's ear twitched at the contact, but he still didn't look at her. His vigil remained unbroken, his loyalty absolute. The drive to her father's house took 20 minutes through streets she'd once known by heart, but now felt foreign. Willow Creek had changed in the years she'd been gone. New developments sprawled where fields had once stood. The downtown, she remembered, with its hardware store and local diner, had been replaced by chain restaurants and boutique shops aimed at tourists visiting the nearby state park. She'd been back so rarely in the past decade that each visit revealed new losses, familiar landmarks erased and replaced with structures that held no memory. Her father's house looked smaller than she remembered. It was a modest ranch-style home on the east side of town, with a yard that had once been meticulously maintained but now showed signs of neglect. The grass needed cutting. The paint on the shutters was peeling. A gutter hung loose from the roofline, dangling like a broken limb. Emma had arranged for the utilities to stay on, had planned to spend the next few weekends sorting through her father's belongings, deciding what to keep and what to donate. Now that timeline felt urgent. The house smelled like her father, coffee and old books, and the particular mustiness of a place where someone had lived alone for too long. Emma moved through the rooms methodically, searching for anything that might explain the connection between Robert Chen and Marcus Reed. Captain's absence from the home felt enormous. She could see evidence of the dog everywhere. Food and water bowls in the kitchen, a dog bed beside the couch in the living room, chew toys scattered across the floor. Her father had built his life around this animal, had structured his daily routines to accommodate walks and feedings and companionship. She started in the bedroom, going through drawers and closets with a systematic precision she'd learned in her work as a research librarian. Her father had been organized to a fault, everything labeled and categorized. She found tax returns dating back 30 years, medical records filed by year, receipts bundled and stored in chronological order. But nothing about Marcus Reed, nothing that explained the connection. The study yielded similar results. Her father's desk contained recent bills, correspondence with his doctor, subscription renewals for magazines about gardening and military history. The bookshelves held volumes on World War II, Vietnam, the Korean War. Emma pulled books down at random, shaking them to see if anything fell out. Nothing. She checked behind picture frames, under the desk drawer liner, inside the hollow bases of bookends. Her father had been thorough in whatever secret he'd kept. She found it in the basement, inside a box marked "Personal Do Not Open" in her father's precise handwriting. The box sat on a high shelf in the corner farthest from the stairs, behind several containers of Christmas decorations and old tax documents. Emma had to drag over a stepladder to reach it, and even then she nearly missed it in the dim light from the single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The box was heavier than she expected. She carried it upstairs to the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she cut through the packing tape that sealed the top. Inside, wrapped in layers of tissue paper, were photographs. Dozens of them, showing her father as a young man, younger than she'd ever seen him in any family album. He wore a military uniform she didn't recognize at first, standing beside another soldier whose face she'd never seen, but whose eyes held the same intensity she'd observed in Captain's amber stare. The photographs documented a friendship. Robert Chen and Marcus Reed in various locations, standing beside a military transport vehicle, sitting in what looked like a barracks, kneeling beside dogs, German shepherds, clearly military working dogs based on their vests and equipment. In every photograph, the two men stood close, their body language speaking of deep familiarity and trust. In several images, they had their arms around each other's shoulders, laughing at something beyond the camera's frame. Emma turned over one of the photographs. On the back, in her father's handwriting, "Robert and Marcus, K9 Unit, Fort Benning, Georgia, 1982. She felt her breath catch. Her father had been in the military. In her entire life, he'd never mentioned service. She'd gone through his closet after his death and found no uniforms, no medals, no indication he'd ever worn a uniform. She dug deeper into the box, her movements becoming frantic. Service records, commendations for valor, certificates of completion for specialized K9 training. Letters written in her father's hand to someone named Marcus, never sent, spanning decades. The paper had yellowed with age, the ink fading in places, but the words remained clear. "Marcus, it's been 5 years since I saw you last. I still think about that night in Germany, about the promises we made. I married Sarah, like I told you I would. She's pregnant now. I haven't told her about you, about us. How can I? How can I explain what we meant to each other when I don't have the words for it myself?" Emma's hands shook as she read letter after letter. Her father's words painted a picture of a relationship that went beyond simple friendship, a bond forged in circumstances she couldn't fully understand, but could feel in the careful way her father chose his words. He wrote about missing Marcus, about wishing things could be different, about building a life that felt like a compromise with something he'd lost. The letters stopped in 2009. The final one, dated June 15th of that year, was different from the others. "I read about your death in the Army Times. Heart failure, they said. You were only 49. I wasn't there. I should have been there. We lost touch after Germany, after I got married and you stayed in. I heard through the grapevine that you'd made Sergeant Major, that you were training K9 handlers at Fort Polk. I meant to write, meant to visit, but the years kept passing and it got easier to pretend that chapter of my life had closed. Now you're gone, and I never got to tell you that I'm sorry. Sorry for choosing the easier path. Sorry for not being brave enough to live the truth we both knew. I'll carry this with me until they put me in the ground beside Sarah. Maybe then I'll find peace." At the bottom of the box, beneath the letters and photographs, Emma found a veterinary report dated 7 years ago. The document detailed the rescue and rehabilitation of a German Shepherd found on Highway 17, approximately 15 miles outside Willow Creek. The dog had been severely malnourished, dehydrated, suffering from exposure. His microchip had identified him as Captain, formerly of the U.S. Army K-9 Corps, listed as deceased in 2009, the same year Marcus Reed had died. Beneath the report, in her father's handwriting, "Marcus's dog thought he was gone. This is a miracle. A second chance I don't deserve, but will treasure." Emma sat at the kitchen table as darkness fell outside. The box of her father's secrets spread before her. The pieces assembled themselves with brutal clarity. Her father and Marcus Reed had served together, had been more than friends in a time and place where such relationships had to stay hidden. They'd lost touch after her father left the military, after he'd chosen the socially acceptable path of marriage and family over the truth of who he loved. Marcus had died alone, his service dog somehow surviving, wandering for years before ending up on that highway median where her father found him. She understood now why her father had named the dog Captain, why he'd devoted himself so completely to the animal's care. Captain wasn't just a pet. He was a living connection to the man her father had loved and lost, a second chance at guardianship he'd failed to provide the first time. Every walk, every meal, every moment of attention was an act of penance and love directed at a memory that her father had carried in silence for decades. Emma looked at the clock. It was past 8. The cemetery had been closed for hours. She grabbed her phone and called Tom Morrison's number, which he'd given her that afternoon. "Tom, it's Emma Chen." "Is Captain still there?" There was a long pause. "Yes. Dr. Martinez examined him about an hour ago. Emma, it's not good. He's in acute renal failure from dehydration. His heart rate is dangerously irregular. She says if we don't intervene in the next few hours, he won't survive the night." Another pause. "She's willing to sedate him, bring him to the clinic, start IV fluids, but she needs your permission. You're listed as his owner now, according to your father's will." Emma looked at the photographs spread across the table, her father young and smiling, his arm around Marcus Reed, Captain sitting between them, alert and strong. She thought about loyalty, about love that transcends death, about promises made and kept across impossible distances. "I'm coming back to the cemetery," she said. "Don't do anything until I get there." She drove through the dark with the box of photographs beside her in the passenger seat. Rain continued to fall, lighter now but persistent, drumming against the roof of her car in a rhythm that matched her racing thoughts. The cemetery gates were locked when she arrived, but Tom was waiting at the entrance with a key. "I called ahead," he said, opening the passenger door to look at the box. "Told Dr. Martinez you were bringing something that might help." They walked together through the dark cemetery, Tom's flashlight cutting a path between the graves. Emma could see Captain's form ahead, still sitting vigil beside grave 247. Tom had erected a small tarp over the dog, creating a makeshift shelter that kept off the worst of the rain. Dr. Martinez sat nearby under an umbrella, a medical bag open beside her. "He won't let me touch him," the vet said as Emma approached. She was younger than Emma expected, maybe 35, with kind eyes and mud staining her knees. "I got close enough to check his pupils and respiratory rate, but when I tried to examine him further, he growled. Not aggressive exactly, more like he's asking to be left alone." Emma knelt in the mud beside Captain, spreading the photographs around the grave just as she had the letters. Her father in his uniform, Marcus Reed beside him, Captain, younger, stronger, alert, sitting between them. She placed the letters there too, the ones her father had written but never sent, Words about friendship and loss and carrying on when the world expects you to. "Your job is done," Emma whispered, running her hand along Captain's spine. She could feel every vertebra, every rib. The dog was dying, had been dying since the moment they lowered her father into the ground. "They're together now. You can rest." For the first time in 4 days, Captain's eyes shifted. He looked at Emma, then at the photographs, then back at the grave. His head tilted slightly, that same measuring gaze she'd seen during her rare visits home, but something had changed in it. Some of the guardedness had softened. A sound emerged from his throat, not quite a whine, not quite a bark, but something that held recognition and release in equal measure. His tail moved once, twice, stirring the mud. "I understand now," Emma continued, her voice breaking. "About my father, about Marcus. About why you can't leave." She picked up one of the photographs, holding it where Captain could see. "You were there, weren't you? You saw them together. You knew what they meant to each other." Captain's gaze fixed on the photograph. His ears, which had been pinned back for days, slowly rotated forward. He leaned toward the image, his nose nearly touching the faces of the 2 young soldiers. Tom Morrison cleared his throat. "Emma, I don't mean to interrupt, but Dr. Martinez says we're running out of time. If you want to save him—" "I don't want to save him," Emma said quietly. The words surprised her even as she spoke them, but she knew they were true. "I want to give him what my father couldn't give Marcus. I want to let him stay." Dr. Martinez frowned. "I don't understand." Emma looked up at the veterinarian, then at Tom. "Can the cemetery make an exception for a military dog?" Tom and Dr. Martinez exchanged glances. "You want to bury him here?" Tom asked carefully. "Near your father?" "Between them," Emma corrected, gesturing to her mother's grave 30 feet away, and Marcus Reed's plot where Captain maintained his vigil. "Where he belongs, where they all belong." The silence stretched for a long moment, filled only by the sound of rain and Captain's laboured breathing. Finally, Tom nodded slowly. "I'll need to make some calls," he said. "Board of Directors, county permits. But for what it's worth, I think it's the right thing to do." Dr. Martinez moved closer to Captain, her movements slow and gentle. "If we're doing this, let me at least make him comfortable. I can give him something for the pain, keep him warm, let him pass peacefully." Emma nodded, unable to speak. She watched as Dr. Martinez prepared an injection, explaining in a soft voice what she was doing. "This will help with the pain," she told Captain, as if he could understand. "You'll feel sleepy, but it won't hurt anymore." The injection took effect quickly. Captain's trembling eased. His breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, slowed to a more regular rhythm. He shifted his position slightly, lowering himself from a sitting position to lying down, his head resting on his paws. For the first time since the burial, he looked peaceful. Emma stayed with him through the night, Tom and Dr. Martinez keeping watch nearby. She talked to Captain about her father, about the man she'd thought she knew, and the one she was only now discovering. She read aloud from some of the letters, sharing her father's words with the dog, who might have heard them before, in a different time and place. "He loved Marcus," she said, as dawn began to break. "I don't know if they ever said it out loud, if they ever acted on it, but it was love. And he loved you, because you were Marcus's dog, because you were the closest thing he had left to that connection." She paused, wiping tears from her face. "I'm sorry I didn't understand. I'm sorry I wasn't here more. I'm sorry for so many things." Captain's breathing changed as the sun rose. It became shallower, more irregular. Dr. Martinez moved closer, checking his pulse with gentle fingers. "Soon," she said quietly. Emma positioned herself so that Captain's head rested in her lap. She held one of the photographs where he could see it, her father and Marcus, young and whole and smiling, with Captain sitting between them. "Look," she whispered. "See them? They're waiting for you, both of them." Captain's eyes fixed on the photograph. His tail moved once more, a final wag so faint Emma almost missed it. His breathing caught, released, and stopped. The rain had finally ended. The first real sunlight in 4 days broke through the clouds, warming the ground around them. "Doctor." Martinez checked for a pulse, then nodded. "He's gone." Tom Morrison made his phone calls. The cemetery board, after hearing the story, approved the request unanimously. "First time in 80 years we've buried a dog in Willow Creek Memorial," the chairman said. "But there's a first time for everything, I suppose." Emma arranged for a small marker to be placed between her mother's grave and Marcus Reed's plot. The inscription took her 3 days to finalize. She wanted something that honored Captain's loyalty without explaining too much, something that would allow her father's secret to remain his own while still acknowledging the love that had shaped his final years. The marker, when it was finally placed, read simply, "Captain, faithful guardian, at rest with those he loved, 2002-2026. She visited weekly after that, bringing fresh flowers for all 3 graves. The story of the loyal dog who'd refused to abandon his post spread through Willow Creek. The local newspaper ran a feature. A regional news station sent a crew to film a segment. Other families began leaving small toys and treats near Captain's marker, tokens of respect for devotion that had moved even strangers. Emma found herself becoming Captain's chronicler, the keeper of a story that was really 3 stories intertwined. She compiled her father's letters and photographs into an archive, donated it to the local historical society with instructions that it be sealed for 25 years. Let future generations, she thought, judge her father's choices with the perspective of distance and hopefully greater understanding. She moved back to Willow Creek 3 months after Captain's death, accepting a position as head librarian at the public library. The job paid less than her Boston position, offered fewer opportunities for advancement, but it felt right. She was done running from her father's memory, from the complicated legacy he'd left behind. On the first anniversary of Captain's death, Emma brought a German Shepherd puppy to the cemetery. She'd found him at the same shelter where her father had volunteered after finding Captain on that highway median. The shelter director had shown her 3 dogs, but this one, a 6-month-old with soulful eyes and gentle disposition, had walked straight to her and sat down, his head tilting in that same measuring way Captain had perfected. She'd named him Marcus, a choice that felt both heavy and right. Some of her friends had questioned it, had suggested it might be healthier to choose a name without so much baggage. But Emma had learned something from her father's story, from Captain's loyalty, from the secrets that had shaped lives across decades. Love doesn't become lighter by pretending it didn't exist. Grief doesn't fade by refusing to speak names. Sometimes the heaviest burdens are also the most sacred. Marcus sat between the 3 graves while Emma told him the story of the dog he'd never met, the men who'd loved each other through war and beyond, the loyalty that had outlasted every ending. The puppy listened with the grave attention of his breed, his eyes moving from grave to grave, as if he understood the weight of the history she was sharing. "You're not him," Emma said, running her hand through Marcus's thick fur. "You don't have to be, but I hope you'll help me remember them, all of them." The wind carried the scent of autumn leaves and fresh earth. Children played in the distance, visiting their grandparents' graves with parents who'd heard Captain's story and brought their families to pay respects. An elderly veteran had started a tradition of leaving flags at all 3 graves on Memorial Day and Veterans Day, a gesture that required no explanation but carried profound meaning. Emma thought about the cemetery groundskeeper who'd shown her the database entry for Marcus Reed, setting in motion the discoveries that followed. About the veterinarian who'd granted Captain those final comfortable hours rather than forcing intervention he'd rejected. About strangers who left flowers for a dog they'd never known, moved by a story of devotion that transcended species and circumstance. About how grief, when shared, becomes something bearable. How love, when witnessed, multiplies itself. Tom Morrison approached across the cemetery lawn, carrying 2 cups of coffee as he did most Saturday mornings when he saw Emma's car in the parking lot. He'd become something like a friend, their weekly conversations ranging from cemetery maintenance to local politics, to the kinds of deep philosophical questions that arise when you spend enough time among the dead. "How's the new one settling in?" he asked, nodding at Marcus. "Good," Emma said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Still working on basic commands, but he's smart, quick learner." Tom settled onto the bench Emma had donated, placed strategically where you could see all 3 graves. "Your father would approve, I think, of the dog, of you moving back, of all of it." Emma considered this. Maybe, or maybe he'd tell me to stop living in the past, to build my own life instead of trying to preserve his. "Those 2 things aren't mutually exclusive," Tom observed. He sipped his coffee, steam rising in the cool autumn air. Plenty of room in a life for both remembering and moving forward. Marcus leaned against Emma's leg, warm and solid and alive. Above them, the sky opened into the particular blue that follows long rain, the kind of day her father had loved. Emma placed her hand on Captain's marker, felt the stone warming under her palm. "Thank you," she said to the graves, to the dog who'd taught her about devotion, to the father she'd finally come to understand, to the man whose love had shaped everything without ever being spoken aloud. "Thank you for not leaving. Thank you for staying until I finally saw." A family approached from across the cemetery, parents with 2 young children who couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. The mother carried flowers. They stopped a respectful distance away, and the mother spoke softly to her children, gesturing toward the 3 graves and Captain's marker. The children listened with wide eyes, then carefully placed their flowers beside the others, already decorating the sites. "For the loyal dog," the little girl said seriously, her voice just loud enough for Emma to hear. "For all of them," her brother corrected. "Mommy said they all loved each other." The family stayed for a few minutes, then moved on to visit their own relatives elsewhere in the cemetery. But they'd left something behind beyond flowers. A reminder that love stories come in forms we don't always recognize, that loyalty sometimes requires witnesses, that the bonds we forge in life can echo long after we're gone. Emma finished her coffee as the sun climbed higher. Marcus dozed in the warmth, his breathing deep and even. Tom returned to his rounds, pausing to straighten an American flag that had tilted in last night's wind. The cemetery hummed with quiet life, birds in the trees, squirrels chasing each other across the lawn, the distant sound of a lawnmower preparing the grounds for another week of visitors. She would come back next Saturday and the Saturday after that. She would bring Marcus and fresh flowers and new stories to share with the dead, who, she was learning, weren't really gone so long as someone remembered them. She would continue building the archive of her father's life, adding her own observations and reflections to the historical record she was creating. She would live her life here in Willow Creek, in the shadow of secrets and love and loyalty that had taken her father a lifetime to express. And when her time came, when they laid her to rest in this same cemetery, she hoped they would place her near these 3 graves, near the dog who'd taught her about faithfulness, near the father who'd shown her that truth sometimes takes generations to fully reveal itself, near the man whose love had been both hidden and eternal. Until then, she would visit. She would remember. She would bear witness to love in all its complicated, painful, beautiful forms. She would not leave.